Hello and welcome to my art channel, Art Horizon. In this episode, we're exploring the question of shadow value, how dark or light the shadow can be. What are conditions for the lighter shadows or for a darker shadows? It's a big question, so let's get to it. Does the lighter value object, like an egg, will have a lighter shadow shape relative to a darker value object like this blue vase? How does the local value of the object influences the value of shadow shape? Does the lighter egg will have a lighter shadow and the darker vase will have a darker shadow? It's hard to say yes or no on this question. It so much depends on the environment that these objects are placed to. If you place this egg in a very dark environment with very little light reflecting, the shadow of that egg can be darker than if this dark blue vase placed on a white tablecloth in a very lit up environment. So you can see how in painting there is really very few things that are absolute, and most of them are really depends on the relationship of many parts and many conditions. So if you think about the shadow as something that gives the weight to the object, the heavier the object, the darker shadow shape it should have. The feather, the cloud, will never have as dark of a shadow as something like painted white brick. As I said, it also very much depends on how much reflective light the environment is able to give back to the shadow. But if we have to talk about absolute, the value of the shadow is dark because the light is absent. And as you know, you cannot be more absent or less absent. You're either here or not here. And if the light is not here, you can't see the shape. The value of the shadow shape is dark. When we look at shadow shapes, we often see a lot of variations of darker to lighter. But the true shadow shape is always dark. What makes it look like the shadow getting lighter is the appearance of the secondary light source, whether it's an object that's reflecting light into bottom plane, or it's an air, or it's a sky reflecting itself into an object. So the shadow itself is always dark. And if you have to make a mistake on the value of the shadow, I would encourage you to make it darker rather than lighter, because you can always lead up the shadow by adding reflective light. And so on the example of portrait, I'm going to prove to you the advantage of the darker shadows over the light shadows and what the lighter shadows do to the painting. So let's take the shadow shape that we use, the raw umber, maybe a little transparent red oxide, and then we'll put a little bit of cadmium red to light it up. Always remember that cadmium red is very strong in its tinting power, so it's able to change the color quite quickly. All you need is just a pin drop of it. So let's say that this, maybe even for the sake of the argument, I will darken it a little bit more, but keeping it warm. I don't want my shadows to be too cool, because that's going to result in my shadows looking too flat and not receding into the space. So here I painted my shadows nice and dark. And when I look at the portrait now with the shadow shape being so dark, what I can say that his face has a certain weight, and that this shadow is able to be very descriptive of what is in light and what is in shadow. That after this corner, the plane is turned away from the light, and the light is kept in place by the shadow. So you have a flow of light flowing through the top and across the form, through topography of all the valleys and hills. And then you have a solid, mysterious, stable shadow shape that is holding and complementing the movement of light by its stability. Now, for the sake of the argument, I will lighten that shadow, and we will see what effect that will bring to the portrait and how it's going to influence and change the light. So I'm not using any white, I'm using mostly warm colors, cadmium yellow and more cadmium red. Maybe I'm going to use a little bit more warmer color of red. But the main thing, my task, is to lighten this shadow to demonstrate the effects it will have on the painting itself. I think it's light enough. It probably went up at least 2-3 steps higher than it was. You can see that now the face has lost the feeling of weight, that nothing really grounds this shadow shape and the face. But the main thing, notice what happened to the light. Let's come from the side plane of the jaw to the chin and see that the eye can easily transpass the border between the light and the shadow, that the form is no longer turning, but coming back to meet the light. And so instead of dimension, we now got flatness. And there is no shadow shape that is supporting the light because there is no contrast between the two. It no longer performs the most important function of holding the light back in its place, helping and framing the light and stopping the light on the edge of the form that is no longer available to the light. So as you can see, the portrait has become more weightless, less dimensional, and less lit up because the contrast between the light and the shadow got very close, and the mystery of shadow no longer exists, as you can see the edges much more clearly than the darker shadow that has lost the edges to the hair shape. And now if I need to bring a reflective light into the chin, I would have to make it more lit up to make it look like a reflective light. And that is the value that is present on my light. So the value of this yellow is almost the same, if not brighter, as a down plane of this jar. And as we already know that nothing in the shadow shape can be the same as in the light. So the darkest light has to be still brighter than the lightest light in your shadow shape. In other words, the kingdom of light is its own place, and the kingdom of shadow its own. They never intersect, they never cross over, and they keep their borders without being broken in or weakened. So I hope that helps. But I do want to make one more point, is that the shadow shape always relates to the background by its color. And so if I would bring more light to my background, can you see how the shadow becomes darker? What if I make it even lighter? Maybe even cooler. Notice how the shadow shape is becoming darker and more mysterious. So there is always more than one solution to the problem. One solution would have been to go back and really darken the shadow shape back. Another solution is adjust the background. However, adjusting the background has its own price to pay. You notice how the light weakens by lightening the background. We still want to have enough contrast. So maybe parts of the light will have to be still brightened to create a perfect harmony and a perfect relationship between the background, the shadow, and the light. Thank you so much for your attention. If you liked that video, please subscribe and share with others. In my next video, we're going to explore the question, how local color of an object influence the color of the shadow. And if we have more than one color objects, do we paint different color shadows? Or is there a way to unify the shadows together? Thank you so much.